But let's consider the subject objectively. Nigeria has a population of 180 plus million, and projecting our growth rate in Edo State from our last census in 2006, only about 4.1 million of those people actually live in Edo State. In the women ages 15 to 24 demographic, that's the age group of women who are most vulnerable to being trafficked, there are about 470,000 of us. We know that poverty is one of the primary indicators of vulnerability to trafficking, and so using Edo State's poverty rate of 19.2%, approximately 90,000 of that 470,000 are arguably the most vulnerable to trafficking. 90,000. That's only a little bit over the size of one World Cup stadium full of women and girls. And speaking of World Cup, by the way, statistics indicate that at least 2,000 Nigerian women were trafficked into Moscow. I know of at least one that was murdered 2 weeks ago while working as a prostitute. But back to the 90,000. What if we were to identify these young women and girls, really seek to identify those who are most vulnerable to trafficking, and find a way to provide sustainable economic and educational empowerment for them, while simultaneously addressing their mindset and cognitively restructuring their belief system? Could we potentially drastically reduce and work towards eradicating sex trafficking, which has become a weapon of mass destruction in Edo State? That's what Pathfinders, my NGO, has determined to do via two of our projects, Project Restore and HERS. These are two projects that will identify the most vulnerable in Edo State and provide customized interventions in all 18 local government areas to counteract the likelihood that at least 1/3 of these young women will be recruited. We're utilizing an interdisciplinary methodology that's combining human rights, cognitive restructuring, and economic development as a solution to sex trafficking. Perhaps if Faith had had access to this support, she might still be alive today. She grew up in Benin City. She was poor and uneducated. She had no access to sustainable economic opportunities. And because she grew up in a society that culturally has been complicit in promoting sex trafficking, she volunteered to be trafficked overseas in the hopes of improving her life. It was in Libya that she was initially sold for the first time. And then in Moscow, she was forced into prostitution to repay a debt of $45,000 to her traffickers. She told me that every single day, think about this, she was forced to have sex with anywhere between 12 to 15 men, earning $5 to $10 per customer. Imagine how long it will take to pay back $45,000. She was repeatedly raped. She was beaten. She was verbally and emotionally abused. As a result of the assault on her body, she developed repeated kidney infections. But because her traffickers were unwilling to afford her the dignity to obtain antibiotics, those repeated infections progressed to kidney disease. Yet, her traffickers forced her to continue to work, because at that point she had only repaid $27,000 of her debt. Close to death in 2012, she was discarded on the streets of Moscow because she became useless to her traffickers. At that point, her one wish was to return to Nigeria to be reunited with her 4-year-old daughter. So working with several of our partners, Faith returned to Nigeria in November of 2015. It was our intention to provide her with 6 weeks of dialysis treatments while we desperately tried to fundraise the $35,000 that she needed to secure a kidney transplant. There was no help coming, not from government, and trust me, I tried. There was no help coming from the private sector, and there certainly was no help coming from her impoverished family. Those 6 weeks churned into 6 months, at the end of which we still were unable to raise the $35,000. I remember the last conversation that I had with Faith, and the words that convict and inspire me to continue to do this work. I'm dying! Auntie, I'm dying! Faith passed away in September of 2016. She was survived by her mother, her brother, and her 8-year-old daughter. She was 31 years old, and she still owed $18,000. You see, Faith's story is not much different from the reality of the stories that I hear from our survivors on a daily basis. Most of them leave Nigeria not because they have given up on their country, but because they believe that their country has given up on them. Happy Independence Day for who? Most of them leave Nigeria with one thing that the traffickers have been able to manipulate and restore back to them: hope. They may know that they will work in prostitution, but most of them are completely ignorant to the reality of what they will face when they arrive. Most of the women that we worked with owe a debt of anywhere between $35,000 to $50,000 to their madams for smuggling them into Europe, even though the trip cost an average of $2,500. The madams, most of who were trafficking victims themselves at one point, seized their passports. They forced them to do things that nobody could ever imagine. Many of them have sworn juju oaths before shrines, before native doctors, and even before some pastors. Their movement is limited, it's restricted. They're beaten, they're raped, some by up to 15 men at a time. Abortions are readily used as birth control. In fact, one of our survivors told me on Friday that within 8 hours of an abortion, her Madame Jejeje escorted her back on the streets. In addition to repaying this debt that I mentioned through prostitution, our sisters are forced to pay their madams for rent, for food, for the clothes on their backs, and for the condoms, which most of their customers will reject. Most will never send a single kobo back to support their families in Nigeria until and unless that debt has been repaid. On average, this takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years, with their young bodies having withstood sex with anywhere between 4,000 to 6,000 men. They return back to Nigeria in broken pieces. And so before you judge them, there but for the grace of God go I. Nobody chooses that. These are the women that we partner with to rebuild broken dreams. These are the women whose voices we amplify because, make no mistake, every woman has a voice. No one is voiceless. And so we craft solutions, we craft interventions because we seek a Nigeria, because what we seek for Nigeria is structural transformation that is embedded in our deep desire to see our women move from poverty reduction to wealth creation. We're looking ahead